It's time for some context. A lot of this is pretty basic, especially to the other weirdos that spend all their time on a forum dedicated to the topic. Rare is a company I talk too much about here on the channel, so I'll skip the preamble, and just say from 1994 till about 2002, they were basically seen as a Nintendo mainstay, and to some they were the entire reason they loved Nintendo systems, whether it be the Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, Game Boy, or even the GameCube. Rare and their Rareware were always going to make the systems better. This was never going to change. Anyway, this started to change as the GameCube rolled into place. Rare needed some more financial stability due to the rising cost of video game development, and they wanted to be purchased. Nintendo didn't want to fork over the money, so instead Microsoft bought them. And that's great. It meant the Xbox got some of its best ever games thanks to Rare, and even a couple of people played them. But this did leave a hole in Nintendo. Donkey Kong as a brand, as a character even, was reinvented by the studio. Donkey Kong Country games blew everyone away. The Donkey Kong Land games made me, and only me, happy, and DK64 also happened. But there was originally going to be much more. There were planned Donkey Kong games for the GameCube developed by Rare that never saw completion. Nintendo basically entrusted Donkey Kong with Rare, but they were now left alone to drift, Rareless. To the kinds of people that obsessed over Donkey Kong and Rare as a whole, this seemed like the end times. Everyone turned their backs on these developers and the many franchises they spawned. There were infamous moments like EGM's 2005 list of the 10 most overrated games. Of that 10, 5 of them were from Rare, and number 2 itself was Donkey Kong Country. This wasn't an isolated experience. Things were so bleak that even an official Nintendo magazine reviewing the 2005 GBA remake of DKC3 continuously complained with quotes like, "Super Mario World has aged beautifully because the design was peerless. We get the impression that Rare knew the core gameplay in DKC was as flimsy as wet paper." And the end of their review is the verdict. The appeal was always the graphics. Be honest, now the looks have faded. You can see she was never that interesting in the first place. Fat bitch. This was from a Nintendo magazine. At this time, Donkey Kong was returning to his older roots with the Mario vs. Donkey Kong franchise of games, which, while still fun, only took the modern design Rare made for Donkey Kong, but nothing else. These were sequels to the arcade games, nothing from the 90s. Besides DK94, I guess. That same year saw Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, an all-new console platformer that is frankly a great game and everyone should play it. I never want to come across as negative towards it. It's just that it carried over nothing from Donkey Kong's previous outings, except his design. It was an all-new world with a new aesthetic and new animal buddies. New everything. Well, except a banana. And there was also Donkey Konga and its sequels, which did carry over some of the Rare aesthetic. We even had characters like Diddy Kong, Cranky Kong, Ellie the Elephant, Banana Birds, and maybe more if I played this game for more than a minute. But these were just spin-offs that upset the hardcore fans more than anything because of the portrayal of the characters and the lackluster music selection. Donkey Kong's identity was in crisis. The cast of characters were dead outside Donkey Kong himself, and sometimes Diddy Kong whenever a partner was needed. Sure, there were remakes of these games on the Game Boy Advance, but these weren't new obviously, unless you were one of the many kids who discovered the series of these remakes. I know it doesn't sound that bleak to say Donkey Kong was still getting a bunch of games and even remakes of his old games, but at the time the dismissal was very prominent, and a lot of this was fueled by things like the not great translations we were graced with back then, like the most infamous example of when Yoshiaki Koizumi said that the Rare look of Donkey Kong wasn't fresh enough for today. That wasn't what he actually said, but that's all people knew it as for a long time. So of course this fueled bitterness. It seemed like he was dismissing Donkey Kong Country, even if he actually wasn't. Thankfully, there was a light at the end of his tunnel, and it was the Japanese studio Payon, who showed us the Rare cast of characters weren't dead after all. They were actually still fresh. DK King of Swing is on the surface a weird spin-off focused entirely on a single gameplay mechanic, but it's much more than that. It's that, plus it has a bunch of Kongs from before, including Wrinkly Kong's ghost, and we have all sorts of returning enemies, like Neckies and Kremlings and Flip-Flaps. Yeah, those purple bats from Donkey Kong 64 are now called Flip-Flaps. This game gave them a name. But I can't avoid the Ellie in the room any longer. King of Swing is a weird game that is ostensibly a platformer without any platforming. Donkey Kong instead uses his beefy hands and arms almost exclusively as a way to grapple onto floating pegs. This game is all about pegs. And for this video, I'll avoid making any of the obvious pegging jokes that all 10 of us in the King of Swing community continuously make. Anyway, the game is about swinging from pegs, launching yourself from pegs, and occasionally launching from a standstill on the ground to the safe, welcoming embrace of these pegs. It's like the floor is made of lava, except instead of killing you, it's just really boring being on the ground. They knew this all was a bit much, so we start with an unskippable tutorial to teach us all the basics. Thankfully it's done by Cranky Kong, and he uses his dead wife to demonstrate how you're meant to play. It's a short and harmless tutorial, and it was basically justified since without it, people would get stuck immediately. But it does suck for those of us that want to play this game on a fresh save after we're already familiar with the game. It is still really robust. It even teaches you mechanics that feel really out of place, like healing yourself or gaining temporary invincibility. Both of which costs bananas to use, and are the entire reason you're collecting them during play. Because we have 3 hearts. A very out of place thing for Donkey Kong at the time, but in retrospect, this is just a precursor to the Retro Studios games, which have now normalized it. The motivation for all this peg swinging is that King K. Rool has come in and has stolen all the medals the Kongs now suddenly have. They were to be collected by the Kongs to determine the new jungle hero, whatever that means. But instead of allowing these to be collectibles the Kongs must push themselves to get, they are now scattered across the lands. So now they're collectibles the Kongs must push themselves to get, but slightly harder. King K. Rool, you went too far this time. I do like K. Rool's weird Eggman mech, but other than that this story is even more paper thin than the games preceding it. But on the other hand, who cares? Look, King K. Rool did something, and Donkey Kong has to stop him. That's all my brain cares about. Anything else is superfluous. And this minimalistic story is easy to ignore anyway, because the sprite work here is all we're paying attention to, and it's phenomenal. Payon really captured the look of everyone and converted them to clean pixels, which is easy to forget these characters never really were before. Everyone looks top-notch, and this entire look is one of my favourites for every character lucky enough to get a model in-game. And while you won't see it in the game itself, all the illustrations Payon did for promotional images, which appear in places like the cover and manual, or the Flash minigame, all really expressive, even if it's a style you wouldn't expect to see these characters in. The backgrounds are just as expressive, and they manage to make every level visually look unique, even when in the same world or when they use a similar theme. I can't say enough good things for how good King of Swing looks. Look at Donkey's little dangling feet when he's swinging, or the flip he does when he's doing his attack, or this little ledge animation you'd rarely see since the floor is lava. And it's not just Donkey Kong, Diddy has his own campaign after you beat the game, which is basically New Game Plus. And this game has mini-games as well that can be played against CPU or other human players if you have friends. And this widens the selection of characters even more to include most of the Kongs you see in the game, King K. Rool, a Kremling, and strangest of all Bubbles from the NES game Clu Clu Land. That had a main character swing from pegs too, sorta, not really, but it is a really cute cameo. And the larger point here is all these characters got that level of animation. It's just a shame that you can't see them in the main game, because only Donkey and Diddy can do those levels. But if you want to play a surprisingly okay side mode, that has you covered. Now we start the game proper in the creatively named Jungle World. Wow, this game really is a precursor to Donkey Kong Country Returns after all. There are 4 levels here, and we can tackle them in an order of our choosing somewhat. Because after level 1, Banana Bungalow, we get a choice of Tropical Treetops or Contraption Cave, and after one of those is completed, we can go to Puzzling Pyramid. You have to do all 4 of these, and you'll always start at level 1, and the rightmost level won't unlock until you do a stage connecting to it. But there's still some freedom here in what order you do levels. The other worlds going forward will mostly carry over similar formats to this. While these introductory levels are super standard and devoid of any challenge once you know how to play the game, they do a fantastic job of showing off the beautiful art style. These jungle levels are more than meets the eyes though, as we have caves, temples, and jungles. All environments that borrow heavily from the original Donkey Kong Country, complete with the temples having Kremling decorations, which was a great attention to detail for Payon to capture. These worlds show us more returning faces. We have Flitters and Neeks from DKC2 and DKL2, Flip Flaps from DK64, and Kremlings from most of the series thus far. While this may seem insubstantial, it really is important to remember that this was an oasis to a time where the fandom is worried they'd never see any of these guys again in anything that wasn't a remake. The Kremling enemies here are an amazing introduction, not only because, well, look at them, they look perfect, but they're also enemies that only do things a player can do. Their entire moveset is to swing from pegs, jump from pegs, and throw things while swinging from pegs. All actions you can do. It highlights just how strange the movement system of this game really is, once you realize you're on the receiving end of someone doing the same stuff to you. Now, regardless of whether you're going in for the kill, or to avoid them, you have to factor in a lot more than you do for regular enemies with simple back and forth trajectories. The Kremlings are a fun challenge. And the game really wants you to master the movement system here, because like the preceding games, we have collectibles, this time in the flavour of medals and crystal coconuts. Both require some exploration and murder sprees, though the best of these is when the crystal coconut has us do a bonus stage to unlock it. In the spirit of the series, we launch from a barrel into a special room with a timer. Now collect every banana before the time limit is over to be rewarded with the MacGuffin. I'm genuinely surprised by how much creativity they mined out of these given the very limited mechanics here. They're a blast, and while I don't expect anyone playing this game to go for the full 200%, it's in your best interest to attempt to play all these special stages and go for as close to 100% as you can manage before your index fingers fall off. Actually, on that, I've heard people say this game is painful to play. They'll admit, early during my recent playthroughs, I was experiencing some of that too. I mean, it was never on the level of a Kid Icarus Uprising, but it was more than you'd want or expect. But after playing some more, I guess I adapted to it, so I could say I'm no longer in pain when I play this game. Probably not a high bar since games shouldn't hurt, but if you're scared of any discomfort, take a break and come back to it later. And after enough time, you should be able to shoulder button away to your heart's content. And you really need to be able to handle the finger mashing, because this game has boss fights, and they're all really solid for what the game asks of you. But the first one is easily the least impressive here, since this is when you're still learning the ropes. This giant Kremling statue, named Kongazuma, asks nothing more than you to attack him, wait, and then sometimes move out of the way. The game's dedication to surprising you continues once this boss is defeated, because we get a world that feels really out of place for DKC, but I love it nonetheless. Wild West World is World 2, and it contains a myriad of level themes that live up to the name. The mines are the most obvious holdover from classic DKC, and perhaps the reason they went with this whole desert theme in the first place. I have to praise Payon as well for making these caves look nothing like the ones from World 1. The desert archetype fits surprisingly well for this jungle-dwelling hero. And I love that starting here with the first level, Necky's Canyon, the game elevates itself with not only the return of my favourite vultures, well, the mini versions of them specifically, but we also get a host of new mechanics introduced. Starting off, we're blocked by a wall that we have to destroy by throwing rocks at it. Calmness is done by using one of his shoulder buttons to grab a rock, similar to how we grab onto pegs, and we release a button to throw. Because of the way movement works, it usually means swinging around in circles with one hand and throwing a rock with another, which in turn requires timing and a good idea of where the rock will land after its arcing throw. This, like everything else in the game, is used expertly, and it becomes a mainstay of levels going forward. But we also see the introduction of booster barrels. They're a fun diversion that rocket you about, and are usually used to explore a screen fully. It's a bit antithetical to the rest of the game, but these are usually hidden goodies that are just for completionists who want to find the even more hidden goodies. And most deviously of all, we're introduced to the cracked pegs here. They're just like regular pegs, but they'll break shortly after you grab onto them. You know, this is nothing substantial. The idea of falling or disappearing platforms in games is nothing new. But it's just another small bonus that shows the complete understanding Payon had of this type of gameplay they were experimenting with. We get a cactus level after this, which isn't that amazing beyond its gorgeous aesthetic. And more importantly, we get some returning insects here. We have zingers, which are one of the most recognizable and iconic enemies of the Donkey Kong franchise, right up there with tiki heads, I guess. But a more forgotten face returns here too. Click-clacks. These little beetle guys whose only appearances in games like DKC2 and DKL2. And the only other games they appear in are the two peg-swinging games from Payon. Poor little guys. They're so underrepresented this far, and this is the only level in the game with them as well. I feel bad. We have a tornado level here to cheer me up. Well, not really, I kind of hate playing on this because of the wind physics, but I do love the attention to detail, as when we fall off the side of the screen, we wrap around and we can see ourselves in the background because of the flow of the wind. I don't really have anything interesting to add, that's just cool. And we also get the mine level, which brings in new mechanics to match this environment. There are conveyor belts, which are much more of a threat here than they are in any other game, since most of the movement here is based on grabbing onto a stationary object that is at the mercy of these conveyors. That and the returning handle pegs from World 1 really make this level feel like a mine. We'll see much more of this in World 3, but Payon loved incorporating small changes to the basic peg design to match whatever level theme they were in. No wonder the few people who played this game love it so much. Anyway, we get a much cooler boss fight, this time against Fire Neki, who was a giant Neki who is fiery. The name wasn't really hiding much. It's a big improvement over the first boss though, as this one has us dodging fire projectiles and throwing rocks back at it. Still goes down easily, but it's a lot more fun and challenging. And then it's on to Aqua World, which somehow continues to keep up with the level variety, despite on the surface just being a set of water worlds. The creativity is on full display as early as Stage 1 Risky Reef. As the wonderfully detailed background implies, we're completely underwater, which not only means slower movement, but a whole new set of enemies. Lockjaws return for the first time since Donkey Kong Land 2, and the starfish-shaped Shuri return again from a slightly shorter absence. You can tell the developers had a special attachment to Donkey Kong Country 2, since most of the returning faces were introduced there. And thankfully for those of you who hate underwater physics in games screwing up the movement, this debut stage is the only one of the 4 that actually uses it. Yeah, it's surprising. I kind of expected this whole world to use it, but nope. Instead we get the breathtakingly atmospheric Kremlin camp, and then we have Lockjaw Falls, which has us launch up a waterfall that is constantly bringing the pegs lower and lower. And then most perplexing of all, we have Ship of Souls. I didn't expect a ghost ship level from this game, but it makes sense given Creepy Crow's appearance in earlier games. Immediately, we see the developers find another way to bring immersion into these pegs, as they're now being launched by cannons inside the ship, meaning they have an arcing trajectory. And later on we'll get these weird ghost pegs that only materialize when you're grabbing an adjacent peg. Oh yeah, this level introduces ghosts. Not the most creative thing in the world. though the method in which we dispose of them is, since they become non-corporeal when you're grabbing onto 2 pigs at once. This is important since their movement patterns are erratic. After this, we're brought to perhaps the most interesting boss in the game, though depending on your skill level, it can also be the most infuriating or time-consuming one. Davy Bones' locker contains the eponymous skeleton eel, and okay, never mind, I feel foolish. The whole time I've been playing this game, I've caught up to his tail by catching up to him while he's moving. But no, you can just launch into him and that will stun him and make this fight a lot easier. Okay, disregard what I said about this fight being infuriating or time consuming. If you play it properly, this boss is still interesting, but he's a lot easier to go down. The whole gimmick here is that we have to grab his tail and spin him into the spikes on the wall. It is such a great way of showing just how creative Payon could be with making boss fights. We've already had one where you launch into him, another where you throw rocks, and now this. And the next bosses are also completely different. After we put away this bony boy, we are introduced to Ice World, which warms up my heart as a fan of all things cold. We start off with Cold Forest, and it's a serviceable level, which makes great use of the tires to bounce off, and the barrel cannons that we can aim. Raging Ravine introduces bombs which function similar to rocks, except they explode and are on a timer, so they're not really like rocks at all. Here you'll be using them to break the ice that covers pegboards, but they will be used for more later on. We get one more underwater level which manages to feel nothing like before, as this fashions itself after sunken ruins and is much more reliant on switches to open gates, and the pegs rising up like bubbles. And then we finally have Ice Castle, the only Ice World level to use slippery ice physics. I have to admire the restraint of Payon to keep these usually dreaded platformer staples to a minimum, while they still give us a taste of them for the sake of more variety. I'd probably hate Ice Castle if the whole world was like this, but instead I love this devious map where we slip all the time, which much like conveyor belts is a lot more interesting in a game where you're required to stop and charge up a launching attack. Very traditional platformer obstacles are much more challenging in a game with movement like this. And after that we're onto Sassy Squatch's Lair, a boss fight that incorporates throwing bombs into a moving target's opening and closing mouth, and then climbing upwards with newly created pegs as the play space shifts for each phase. Unfortunately, my immense love for each individual level is about to come to an end. The final world is King K. Rool's airship, and while it makes a great introduction with us using rocket barrels to make it up to his lair, the levels afterwards don't stick out to me as much as I'd like. They're all based around the airship, though there is at least some variety, as it shows us first start off by climbing on the outside, then we're inside the hull, which is blue, only to end in the engine room, which is climactic and filled with warm colours. I don't want to downplay the variety here. These levels did what they had to do, and making an airship as diverse as all the other worlds, which went wild with their concepts, was no easy task. Though perhaps maybe the reason I don't recognise the true amount of differences here in each level is because of those damn cannons that won't stop trying to kill me. That's all I can focus on. Yeah, this last world is not as easy as the rest of the game. Then it's time for a showdown with the man himself, King K. Rool. He says he'll spank you every time you lose, and here we have to put everything we learned to the test. First it's a race which you'll lose repeatedly until you get a feel for it. Then it's a boss fight that feels unlike anything else we've done prior. It's against an enemy that basically does the same stuff you do, and it's a way smaller target than the big boys we've had before. Eventually you'll win and become the jungle hero. Cool. Now do it again but as Diddy, and make sure you collect everything. Or if you have truly nothing else to do with your life, beat every level as Time Attack for both Donkey and Diddy, because their times are slightly different since Diddy is usually the quicker of the two. If I had this game as a kid, I could easily see myself sinking more time into this than anyone ever should. There is a lot of game here, despite it ultimately being a really short game, you can easily beat it under 2 hours. There's even extra multiplayer modes which can be enjoyed with bots if you too are lonely, and this is a fun diversion. It borrows heavily from the K Rool boss fights of before. Here we have 7 racetracks to get to the top of. 2 stages dedicated to attacking each other for a high score, and not previously seen in the game. We have these 2 stages where we have to break the most barrels, and another where we have to change the colours of pegs to outcolor, while enemies try to do the same. You know, it's pretty shallow stuff. This is more of a Crash Bash than anything truly excellent. Sorry to all the Crash Bash fans. But a small multiplayer mode like this, it's still fun, even if it's not what everyone wants all the time. And it feels much more justified here than it does in other games, since where else are you going to see this specific flavour of multiplayer with the peg swinging? It's a fun inclusion that best of all lets us play as King K. Rool, which is so satisfying after all the times I lost to him. DK King of Swing is such an underappreciated gem of the Game Boy Advance library. It made the simple act of moving a character feel alien to me. It's truly unlike anything else out there. Well, besides its sequel for the Nintendo DS, which is better in like every single way. Maybe I should have said that before you watched this whole video. Oh well. And don't be fooled, these are 2 very different games, and King of Swing does do some things better, like this art style here. It's basically exclusive to this one game no one ever plays. And before you can become the Jungle Climber, you need to earn that right by becoming the Jungle Hero here in the debut peg swinging game. And instead of becoming the Jungle Hero, next video will become Alefgard's hero. Dragon Warrior 3 for the Game Boy Color is one of those remakes that probably didn't need to be made, and it's full of concessions thanks to the hardware, but boy do I love it, even if the cartridge is struggling to contain it all.